Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Red Path. It's Dara here again, and we're talking tactics today, specifically the deployment phase. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about some tips and tricks when it comes to deploying your army. A couple of things that maybe some of you folks don't already know or maybe don't put into practice enough. It's going to touch a little bit on like some more basic stuff. So if you're already very familiar with deployment, maybe this isn't one for you, but if you're kind of just getting into sort of the competitive side of things, this can be a great way to start off your game in the right sort of setting and set you up for a stronger opening turn and the turns going forward. So yeah, sit back, grab yourselves a brew. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is pre-measuring. Pre-measuring is something that you can do in 40k, and basically what it means is that you're before any action or sort of attack is happening, you're measuring the ranges from your models to the relevant target and ensuring that things are in range of what you're planning on for them to be. Now, this seems like a really basic concept, but I mean, I'm guilty of it too. I don't always do it, and honestly, it's one of the most important things when you're deploying. So pre-measuring isn't just measuring the range from your units to your enemy units. You're also going to be looking at sort of stuff like measuring range to objectives, we'll say. So for example, I have a squad of cultists and I'm going to be apoplectic frenzying them up the board. I'm going to be measuring where is the closest, we'll say, what is it, 15 inches, including their first move? Where's the closest objective within 15 inches of where they're deploying? So as soon as I put those guys down, I'm measuring, making sure that my objective is going to be close by. So I know 100%, no matter what happens, I'm hopping on that objective in the first turn. So it kind of comes into stuff like that. Similarly, when you're picking your secondaries and stuff, so some of them require certain movement criteria to be fulfilled. For example, Retrieve Octarius Data has to be done more than 6 inches away from sort of the borderline between quarters, or Engage in all fronts has to be done outside of 6 inches of the center. So stuff like that, you need to be pre-measuring those as soon as you're putting down your units. We'll say if I'm dropping a squad of raptors in, we'll say, the bottom left corner, I need to be measuring to make sure that they're going to be getting into the next quarter for, we'll say, Retrieve Octarius Data or Engage in all fronts, and that they won't be sort of moving in such a way that they won't be able to do any of those objectives. So it's really important to pre-measure in those senses, but then obviously pre-measuring ranges for your opponent is so key. So this can be really simple stuff, such as like asking your opponents, okay, how far does that gun shoot? Making sure that you say, okay, even if you move, you're not going to be in range of me after your movement, regardless of what happens, because my model is this many inches away. And that just means that no matter what happens, you're safe. Obviously, some armies, it's almost impossible to arrange them by pre-measuring, but for some armies it isn't. And it's the same when it comes to like pre-measuring for zoning, making sure that things that are going to be jumping 9 inches away from you are more, they're places that you want them to be. You're not leaving gaps or anything like that. So yeah, pre-measuring super key. And also for movement, I think is one of the most important things to pre-measure for when you put a unit down. So ensuring that, we'll say when I put down my termite drill, I'm going to place it in such a place. I know it moves 8. I'm probably advancing it in the first turn because it's not in range. So it's going to move, we'll say 8 plus. Usually I use 2 as my advance roll, just to kind of err on the side of caution. So we'll say it's going to be going 10 in the first turn. I'm looking to see, okay, where is 10 going to take this drill? And where do I want my drill to be at the end of the first turn? Where do I want it to be moving to in the second turn? So I'm looking at stuff like that. That's what my pre-measuring is. And this is obviously all ideal world scenarios. Things are going to change as the game goes on. Units will get destroyed. You're going to have to alter your priorities. But having a plan in mind at the start of the game, when it comes to like pre-measuring your units, knowing where they're safe where they're going to be moving and what objectives they're going to be doing really cuts down on the turn 1 admin, and you don't even have to think as soon as the first turn starts. You know, you're just like, I'm moving this here, I'm going to be moving these guys here, they're going to be doing that thing, and if my opponent goes first, I know that even if they move these things, they're not going to be in range, or if they are going to be in range, I've limited the amount of interaction they can engage with. So that's pre-measuring as a concept when it comes to deployment. Really, really important, but let's move on to the next one now. Okay, so next up we're going to be talking about clarity with your opponent. This kind of follows on from pre-measuring, and in a sense pre-measuring is part of this. So what I mean by this is, as soon as you have an idea in your head of something you want to do, or sort of something that you think might need clarification, you're stating your intent to your opponent. Now, intent is something that's really, really important in 40k. We've talked about it in depth in lots of other videos. I won't get into it here. But what I mean by that, and like pre-measuring is a perfect example. Let's just say this. So I have my squad of berserkers there, I'm putting them down on the board, and I'm measuring and I'm saying, okay, even if you move with your intercessor squad, you're not going to be in range of these berserkers, no matter how far you move in your first turn, because I've measured it and I am outside your maximum threat range. I'm saying that to my opponent and I'm showing them on the measuring tape, this is the definition, and they're okay with that, so that we know as soon as the first turn happens, regardless of what happens in that first turn, we know those intercessors won't be shooting those berserkers. So that clarity is super, super important. It also comes into sort of like when you're deploying your models in and around terrain. We'll say I'm putting my squad of cultists behind a barricade. I'm going to state clearly to my opponent, these guys are behind this barricade, they're going to be receiving the benefits of light cover because I'm putting them here. My opponent will say, yes, that's totally fine, I can see that you're putting them there. So there's no sort of like conversation that needs to be had as soon as the game starts as to whether or not things are in combat, or in cover even. In a very similar way, a lot of the time, and this is probably the more convoluted one, I'll be deploying my vehicles behind obscuring terrain or in and around dense terrain. So I'm going to say, okay, I'm putting my drill here behind this building, and I'm going to say to my opponent, okay, can you see my drill from your, we'll say, raider that could be shooting at it? And they'll get down, they'll check their line of sight, they might say yes, and then I'm basically going to move my drill in such a tiny little way, like, can you see it now? They're going to be like, no, and I'm like, okay, I'm happy, that's where my drill's going to be. Making sure that I have stated that to my opponent before I actually kind of like finish up where I'm placing that model, it's so, so important. Because if I just put that model down and say in my head, okay, it's obscured now, it shouldn't be shot, it's fine, and then turn 1 rolls around and my opponent says, well, I'm going to shoot your drill, and I'm like, but I thought it was obscured, and they say, well, no, I can clearly see it from here. It's a feel-bads moment, and we try and avoid those in games of 40k. So declaring your intent insofar as possible is really, really important in the deployment phase. And again, it's all sort of moving into this like smoother turn 1 without having any awkward conversations going on. So yeah, that's intent when it comes to deployment. Let's move on to the next one. Okay, so next up we're going to sort of dive into different styles of deployment. Now, the way I kind of see it, and this is definitely an umbrella statement, is a lot of the time when it comes to world leaders, we sort of fall into 2 categories of either really aggressive or quite conservative deployment. Now, personally, I believe the more competitive option is to lean into conservative deployment, but I can definitely see merit for the aggressive deployment. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what that kind of aggressive deployment entails first. So typically this means like full commitment to that rush, you know. What I mean by this is you're probably frontlining most of your transports, most of your sort of demon engines, any kind of sort of like dreadnoughts that you have. You're probably also using a lot of apoplectic frenzies, probably pushing a big advanced blob up that board and making sure that you can basically get as far up the board as possible in your first turn. So the pros of this, and there definitely is a few, is that if you do go first, you're going to have fantastic board control. You're going to push all your models right into the middle. You're going to give your opponent a lot to think about in their first turn, especially if you're running, let's say, lots of dreadnoughts and lots of demon engines. If you have those spread out across a really wide front in the first turn, you've got a very commanding position of the board. It also allows you to shorten those distances between objectives and between secondary objectives as well. So straight from the gates, you can be on top of a lot of really important parts of the game. It's really, really useful, but it does come at a significant risk. If you're frontlining your entire army, chances are you're probably not taking advantage of a lot of different types of obscuring or dense terrain, just because it's not very typical for those to be in those positions all the time. You'll certainly be able to get some of your models into cover, be it light cover or dense terrain or whatever, so you will have some benefits, but it probably does mean you're taking a bit of a risk, and you're probably leaving some transports or some heavy hitters in the open where they can be struck. Now, that's all well and good. If you go first, it's not a huge deal because you're pushing up and establishing that board presence, like I said. However, if you don't go first and you end up going second, a lot of your units are vulnerable to being alpha striked. Now, this is really, really prevalent in certain matchups like Dark Elder, Admech, and Sisters of Battle, who can bring a lot of firepower to the table early doors. So you can really fall victim to some big hurt in your first turn if you go for an aggressive deployment. In the same sense, though, you can aggressively deploy against certain other armies that you know don't have a lot of firepower and probably aren't fast enough to get to you in the first turn. Orcs, I think, is maybe one like this where you could probably aggressively deploy and be relatively safe. I haven't played enough orcs yet to really understand exactly how they work, but maybe. There's a couple of other old school 8th edition armies that you can definitely aggressively deploy against, but for the most part, and we're going to get onto that next, I think the conservative deployment is a lot more beneficial. Okay, so moving on to the next one, we got the conservative deployment. Conservative deployment is typically what I do when I'm playing competitive 40k these days. Basically what it means is deliberately withholding some of my potential aggression in the first turn in order to maximize my survivability, and ensure that if I end up going second, I will lose as few assets as possible in my army. What this means is really analyzing the deployment zone, looking at where I can maximize the benefits of terrain. So that means placing as much as I can behind obscuring, interposing in dense terrain, or even if it has to be getting into light cover behind barricades. So a lot of the time this means that my units are going to be starting further back than I would actually like them to be, but I'm kind of okay with that because I'd rather have them starting further back and surviving than starting on the nose of my deployment zone and getting shot off the board before they even do anything. So typically what this entails is it's usually going to be in my current competitive list, one of my termite drills is going to be behind obscuring, as well as one of my leviathans if I can. Generally, it's really, really difficult to get both my drills behind obscuring, so there'll be one somewhat in the open or around dense terrain if I can. And then another Leviathan is actually probably just going to be out in the open. The reason that I do this is it's sort of like a bait unit. So whenever possible, I will deploy this Leviathan with some dense terrain in the way. Usually he won't always be getting that -1 to hit, but insofar as possible, he will be. And then in cases where he can't get that, I always have the smoke launchers to pop off in the first turn. Again, I'm going to be pre-measuring here, making sure that my guy is as far away from the enemy guns as possible, so that if I can outrange them, I will. Obviously, not always easy to do that, especially against Dark Elder. They're so fast and have such good range. But yeah, so that bait is really, really good for sort of drawing the enemy into sort of shooting or attacking a model that they might not easily be able to kill. Similarly, when I'm sort of deploying in this conservative fashion, I will be making sure, and again, just going back to the pre-measuring, I'm measuring my Dark Apostle, making sure that he's within 6 inches of both drills, so that when he does his 5+ aura, that no matter what happens, those drills are going to be in range. Like, that is just so crucial to that conservative deployment, maximizing survivability. Basically, conservative deployment is presenting as little possible threats to your opponent in the first turn, most likely at the cost of movement and engagement for yourself. But, you know, if you deploy on those front lines and your guys get shot off the board straight away, it doesn't really matter that you could have had the movement to get there because they're dead and now they don't exist. As opposed to deploying conservatively where a lot of stuff will survive, and sure, it might not be able to engage until turn 2 or further in, but at least it will be able to engage at some point, and you've got more assets to play around with. It'll draw the game out a little bit more, give you a better plan. So overall, I think a conservative deployment type is probably the way to go, but again, like I said, there is merits for the aggressive one. Okay, so the last thing we're going to talk about, and it would be totally remiss of me to leave this out from a World Leaders deployment video, is Apoplectic Frenzy. So this is a really powerful strat that we have access to, 1 CP, 9-inch pre-game move for an infantry unit. It's so powerful. A forward advance move is one of the strongest mechanics in the game without question, especially in 9th edition, a game that is way more important about objective work. The question should always be what units you're going to frenzy forward, and this is going to vary from game to game, from opponent to opponent, depending on the mission, depending on the matchup. There's a whole huge swathe of variables that I cannot fully get into because it would just take me way too long. But the key takeaway, and this is something that I actually only started doing recently, which is kind of silly of me, is to deploy the units that you intend to frenzy at the very end of your deployment. This seems incredibly obvious, but when you think about it, if you're deploying these guys last, you're going to be able to see the vast majority of the enemy army in front of you. So you can start pre-measuring those ranges for units that are already on your opponent's side of the board, and understanding that, okay, if I'm going to be apoplecting frenzying a jump pack unit, say like Raptors or Warp Talons, they're going to be moving 9, then they're going to be moving 12. Their target is this enemy unit who is now deployed, so I can measure the range from there to there and say, okay, they're 100%, if I put them here, they're going to need this charge if I go first. In a similar way, you know, placing, we'll say, the likes of cultists or even Chaos Space Marines that you're going to be frenzying forward, placing them down last and knowing that, okay, if I put them down here and frenzy them forward, there's a unit of, we'll say, assault intercessors that are going to be able to jump out and charge them almost straight away, as opposed to if you put the cultists down first before the assault intercessors are down, and then your opponent drops those guys down, you're like, well, now my cultists are going to be stuck if I move them forward. So it's all this sort of like reactive thinking when it comes to Apoplectic Frenzy, and I find it really useful to just leave those guys till the end, because they are arguably one of the most important things that you're going to be doing in the first turn. So ensuring that you have as clear a picture as possible before you sort of consign yourself to these plays, it's just key. It's so important, and it's the biggest takeaway when you're using Apoplectic Frenzy. Now again, pre-measuring, huge when it comes to that. You need to be understanding where these apoplectic units are going to be moving. Are they going to be on the objectives you want them to be? Are they going to be screening out in a way that you kind of like sort of envision? Are they going to be able to make those charges that you're planning? Making sure that you do these pre-measurements means that come turn 1, you're not going to have any feel bads, you're not going to have any unpleasant surprises. You're going into that turn knowing my units can get to here, and from there they can do X, Y, and Z. So yeah, that's like one of the most important things when it comes to deployment, is just when it comes to playing your Apoplectic Frenzy, you really just hyper focus, make sure that they're going in at the end, that you can look at everything on the board and sort of make a really well-informed decision about where you're going to be spending that CP, where you're going to be pushing that resource, and what you're actually going to be getting from it, as well as the risks of making that play. So that's Apoplectic Frenzy in your deployment phase, and that about wraps it up for this video. So thanks everyone for watching. I hope it was informative to some of you who started getting into this competitive side of things, or maybe a little brush up for people who have been playing for a while and sort of, you know, just needed to kind of dust off that little rust and stuff. So yeah, thanks everyone for watching. Until the next time, stay healthy, stay safe, and kill Membra.